Programming Librarian at KCPL, and I'm here today with author Eliot Parker, and I'll provide a brief introduction here. Eliot Parker is the author of 5 novels: Breakdown at Clear River, Making Arrangements, Fragile Brilliance, Code for Murder, and A Knife's Edge. He currently teaches English at the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, and he hosts the podcast program Now Appalachia across the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network and Blog Talk Radio, which profiles authors and publishers who live and write about Appalachia. And I'm so glad that you could be here with us today, Eliot.
Hi, Tara. Thank you so much for having me. Great to be with you.
And so I'd like to talk a little bit about your newest title called Snapshots. It's a book of short stories. And I was wondering, could you tell us a bit about that title?
Yeah, sure thing. I'm going to hold up a copy of the book for, if that's all right. There it is right there. Snapshots, a collection of short stories, as you said. This is a collection of short stories. There are 11 short stories in the collection. It is a multi-genre collection of short stories, meaning just about every genre that someone might be interested in reading, or that someone might say, well, I have a favorite. You know, I like romance, or I like mystery thriller, or I like speculative fiction, or I like whatever it may be, family drama stories. All of that is represented here in this work. And basically, you know, when I think about this collection of stories, these stories are all set in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky, which are 3 places that I've either lived or gone to school or am familiar with. And so it's kind of these rugged, raw landscapes of these Appalachian states are profiled through the small towns in these states. And they're really the backdrop of these stories. And basically the kind of theme or the connecting thread that holds all these stories together is that, you know, the decisions and the choices that are made by the characters in these stories, no matter what story it is, forever kind of alter the expectations and the circumstances of them. Meaning that there's a point in every story where the main character or main characters have to make a decision. And that decision is going to either take them down path A or it's going to take them down path B. And sometimes they make the right decision and they do what they should do. And sometimes they make the wrong decision and do what they shouldn't do, even though they know it's the wrong decision. And so it's looking at that concept and how that breaks down into all of those stories. And sometimes those characters that chose the right path, or what they thought was the right path, ends up causing them, you know, a lot of personal pain and heartache. Sometimes when they go down the path they shouldn't go down, they get away with it. So, you know, it just depends on what story it is and what the circumstances are. But that's where that idea of snapshots comes from. It comes from an idea that if you look at it, if you take a snapshot picture, or you're looking at a picture that has been taken, what you're seeing in that picture is a moment in time. And there were decisions and circumstances made to bring that picture together, that snapshot together. And so those decisions kind of ultimately create the snapshot of these characters' lives and these character circumstances after they kind of choose what path they want to go down.
Nice. And so I'm sure you have something special to share about each one of these stories. Are there any in particular that you think stand out, or that you would consider a favorite of yours?
You know, that's a really great question. I like all of the stories for different reasons. I started working on this collection back in 2011. And so some of these stories I've been sort of working on and nursing, so to speak, as a writer a lot longer than some of the others. I like them all for different reasons. I can say that I really liked Old Lady, was a story that I really enjoyed writing. And we can certainly talk more about that later, but it's a story based on an obituary that I read in a newspaper a few years ago about a woman who had lost her husband at a very young age, and he had given her this blue necklace, or this blue amulet to wear around her neck, and she never took it off. And she lived, I believe, something like 50 or 60 years after her husband had died. He died like right after they'd been married. And I thought, well, wow, what the kind of love that those two must have had, or the kind of love she must have had for him, to carry that blue amulet around her neck all these years and never take it off. So that's kind of the backdrop of that story. So I had a lot of fun writing that story because it's from the perspective of a female character, and writing a female character being a male writer was a lot of fun, and kind of getting inside of a woman's psyche and how a woman would react to the loss of someone that she loved dearly like that. That story was a lot of fun. I enjoyed Reckless was a great story that I enjoyed writing. It's about a sheriff named Jonas Holdren who is on his last day as sheriff of a small community, and he is making some decisions that are going to cause him some problems. So Reckless was a lot of fun to write. And I also really enjoyed writing a story called, there's a story in the collection called Sexting, Sexting. And I enjoyed that story because that's loosely based on a personal experience that I had when I was at a minor league baseball game a few years ago. So I think those three are probably my three favorite. And if I had to pick three that when I was writing them in terms of the drafting process, the story came very easily to me, it would be those three.
They sound really interesting. I love these diverse characters that you write. So could you tell us a little bit more maybe about some of the other quirky characters that are featured in the stories?
Oh, sure. We've got a plethora of people with all of the quirky characteristics you could find or would want to find in a collection of stories. And I mentioned a few already, Jonas Holdren in Reckless, the sheriff who's on his last day at patrol. I mentioned the main character, her name is Rachel in the story I was talking about, Old Lady. So we kind of follow her story. In the story Sexting, we follow a story of two people, Harvey and Amanda, who are at a baseball game. Harvey's sort of this diehard baseball fan. Amanda's kind of his sidekick, but it's what Amanda uncovers going on in front of them with a couple that's sitting in front of them that leads to this whole idea of what happens to them in the story. We have a woman. We have a woman named Rhonda Pendleton who is featured in one of the stories, and she is on trial, getting ready to be sentenced by a judge. And she's back before this judge. The title of that story is Special Needs. She's in front of this judge for a drug conviction that has come back up. She was sort of put on probation. Now she has another drug possession and charge against her. Now she's being convicted of that, and she has to go to a facility where she is not supposed to really be for the treatment that she needs, but they have no other option. The judge has nowhere else to put her. So he puts her in a facility that's not really the best for her. And it's a story about how she adjusts to that, and is she able to kind of make something of herself from that. So we have that story. We also have a story called Hub 2000, which takes place at Louisville International Airport in Kentucky. And I don't know if a lot of people know this, but the hub, UPS, United Parcel Service, their airport hub is in Louisville, Kentucky. And I've known a lot of people, went to high school and college with a lot of friends who went to the University of Louisville. They worked for UPS, and if you worked for UPS at the hub, you got your tuition paid for. They gave you a tuition waiver. They paid your tuition and your fees and your expenses and your books and all of that as part of this program. So that got me thinking about setting a story there. And in that story, we have a older student who has been at the hub for a long time, and then a new recruit who comes on that he has to train, and they uncover something very suspicious going on behind one of the air hangars where the planes come in and unload the packages. So we learn a little bit about them. The first story in the collection, called Hands, follows a couple of funeral directors, a couple of morticians. One is named Conley. And we kind of follow Conley's story as he meets someone very suspicious as he's going to the cemetery to conduct a funeral burial. So we've just got all kinds of different characters and different circumstances doing different things in the collection. And so it's got and they're all different. All of the characters are different. They're all quirky in their temperaments. They're quirky in the way that they interact with other people. As I mentioned earlier, the decisions that they make, just when you think one of them is going to take path A, he ends up taking path B, or just when you think, path B is going to be chosen, they take path A. And you have to just go along with the story as the reader, because then you have to determine what's going to happen there. And I wanted to mention one more story. Snapshots, the title story, involves a journalist and a police detective who are in an illicit affair. romantic affair, but there's also a hidden story, a hidden crime story that the journalist named Blake in the story is investigating. And so he and Olivia, who is the detective that he's dating, have to kind of unravel this mystery that he's uncovered, while at the same time keeping their relationship secret from their superiors and their supervisors. So, just a little bit of different flavors of characters, old characters, younger characters, rich characters, poor characters, just the spectrum, just what you would expect kind of in life. All of that is represented here in all of these characters in terms of their personalities and backgrounds.
And mentioned the story Hands. That made me think about one of the stories that I was really fascinated with, called Reflections, that it took place in a cemetery, and it featured several interesting characters. They seemed to, like, maybe they had some really interesting backstories. Could you tell us just a little bit about Reflections?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Reflections is a story. Of all the stories that I have in this collection, I would say Reflections is the one that is most personal, or mostly like me, and mostly based on my personal experience, because as you mentioned, it does take place in a cemetery, and the main character in the story is through a first-person narrator, so we follow this I character at the beginning. But his father is a funeral director, or was a funeral director in this small town, and his father's passed away, and he goes to the cemetery. We find out relatively often, maybe not as often as he should, but he goes relatively often to the gravestone, to the headstone, to see his dad and to spend time with his dad. And that story is loosely based on me because my dad was a funeral director. My dad passed away in 2008 from pancreatic cancer. And I'm not the I character in the story, but I understand those feelings and those thoughts and a lot of the things that he's thinking about when it comes to going and visiting the cemetery and going to the gravestone to see a loved one that you truly miss. A lot of the other details in there about the father and about his relationship with his son and mother is totally made up. That's not based on my relationship with my father or my mother's relationship with my father. I get that question a lot. Well, so is that your mom and dad that you're writing about in the story, or is that you that you're talking about when you say, dad wasn't around much or he wasn't this? No, that's totally made up for the purposes of the story. But kind of the outer shell, the outer setting and structure of the story is the closest thing based on my personal experience. And so basically what we find as our character goes to the cemetery is that he wonders if his dad's work and his dad's life and his dad's legacy really meant anything. And eventually what we find out as we get to the end of the story, he meets the caretaker named James, who's the cemetery caretaker, and it's his responsibility to take care of all the gravestones in the cemetery, keep them clean and free of debris. And my narrator and James have a very interesting discussion about the narrator's father and what his legacy really means. And it is kind of an eye-opening moment for my narrator, and he has to decide, have I been looking at my father the wrong way all this time? Because now I have this person who I don't know and who doesn't know me coming up and telling me all these things about my father. So it's really a good story about love and loss and legacy and what it means to think back on those experiences with the people that we love who are no longer with us for whatever reason. So it was a fun story to write, a really passionate story. And I will say this, Tara, I've had more feedback on that story and Old Lady in terms of being the two stories that people like the most. And when I've been asked to go to readings, I've been asked to do workshops and been asked to come on programs like yours, people always want me to either read from Reflections or Old Lady. So that Reflection story has really made a connection with people for some reason. And I loved writing it and really happy with the way it turned out.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a really good one. I really enjoyed that one. So I'd like to turn for a minute to some questions about your other works and your writing style and things like that. So you have written several titles over the years, and do you happen to have any that you consider your favorites?
Oh, that's a really good question. That's an interesting question to answer because I feel like, and a lot of writers will tell you this, I feel like all of those books are my children, because I've spent so much time with them, and I kind of raised all those characters and raised those stories up from the idea stage to a completed project. I like them all for different reasons. I will say that I really enjoyed the storylines in Fragile Brilliance and A Knife's Edge, which are two books that are a sequel to one another. And they're set in Charleston, West Virginia, where I'm from and where you are now. And it follows a police detective named Ronan McCullough, who is involved in a series of pretty deadly and brutal crimes that take place in Charleston as a crime syndicate kind of moves in. And I started writing I started writing Fragile Brilliance. Fragile Brilliance came out in 2016, and I started working on that book around 2014. And, unfortunately, it was kind of one of those things where reality kind of supplanted the fiction, because part of the storyline in Fragile Brilliance is this syndicate makes its presence in Charleston through the distribution of an illegal drug. And then, and lo and behold, as we know, so much of Appalachia, not just Charleston, West Virginia, but so much of Appalachia is struggling with an opioid epidemic, or has been struggling, and now struggling with a heroin problem and all these other terrible drugs. And so, it wasn't something that I, thought was going to happen in real life, but it's kind of one of those things where reality sort of superseded the fiction. So I enjoyed that story. I enjoyed that, and A Knife's Edge is the sequel, and it kind of picks up about 6 months after the end of Fragile Brilliance. And I like that story because I loved Ronan as a character, and I loved all the characters that are in that book, but I also enjoyed writing a series. That's the first time I'd ever taken another book with the same characters and continued it in a series. And that was really challenging for me as a writer, because you want to keep those characters in A Knife's Edge true to who they were in Fragile Brilliance, but at the same time, you want them to grow and develop, and you don't want them to be the very same character at the end of A Knife's Edge that they were at the beginning of Fragile Brilliance. So that was really challenging for me as a writer, to kind of keep their personality traits the same and how they view things the same, but also put them in circumstances where they can grow and readers can see different sides of their personality. As well. So I would say those two books are probably my favorite, because I love the characters. I love setting a story in Charleston where I grew up, but I love the challenge and the fun that came with writing a series.
Nice. And so about your writing, has your writing been influenced by any other authors?
Oh, absolutely. I've we are so fortunate, Tara, and I know you know this working in the library. Our region, not just West Virginia, but Appalachia as a whole, we have some of the best writers in the country living and writing about Appalachia, living in Appalachia, writing from Appalachia, and writing about Appalachia. And we are so fortunate, whether it's Ron Rash, or it's Crystal Wilkinson, or it's Wiley Cash, or it's, we could just go on and spend, 20 minutes going through a list of all the great Appalachian writers. So certainly David Joy, just a fantastic sort of grit-lit writer. Nick White, I mean, we just go on and on about that. So, I'm always amazed and impressed with the breadth and depth of Appalachian writers that we have, both those bigger names and then those lesser-known names that are coming onto the scene. So I learn a lot from reading those books by those authors about Appalachia, about culture, about the region, and kind of those different authors and their takes on those issues. I would say two writers, though, that have influenced me the most. From a classical perspective, John Steinbeck is a writer that influenced me tremendously. I think his book, East of Eden, a lot of people know him from Of Mice and Men, which is wonderful. A lot of them know him from The Grapes of Wrath, which is wonderful. Travels with Charlie, a lot of folks are familiar with that. But his book, East of Eden, is one of the best books I've ever read on any subject. And it's basically, without getting too much into the details on that, it's basically Steinbeck's interpretation of the Cain and Abel story. Because you have two brothers in the book, Cal and Aaron Trask, who are very much like Cain and Abel from the Old Testament. And so it's kind of his retelling of the Cain and Abel story. But the way Steinbeck could describe setting, and the way that Steinbeck could make a bad character that was just so awful and evil still be someone you were interested in and still be someone you wanted to kind of follow, was a talent that I thought was amazing. And then more of on a contemporary sense, Pat Conroy, the late Pat Conroy, is another writer who greatly influenced me. And just his precision with language and the way he could string together words to where you absorb it as a reader, but you just get lost in the language. I mean, I've read all of Conroy's books, and I can't tell you how many times I'd be reading, and I would get so lost in the prose that next thing I know, 16 pages have gone by, and I feel like I've only been spending 5 minutes with the book. I mean, he was just that kind of writer. So those two writers are two that have really, really influenced me. And then a lot of the great Appalachian writers that I mentioned, and more that I could mention. But the great work that's coming out of Appalachia is amazing. And I would encourage folks to pay close attention to Appalachian literature and poetry and fiction and nonfiction too, that's being produced, because it's some of the best stuff that I've read, and I read all the time. I know you do too. It's some of the best stuff I've read. I mean, I would put our region's writers up against any in the country or any throughout the world, and so I'm thankful for the great work that our Appalachian writers are putting out too.
Awesome. And what advice would you give aspiring writers?
I would simply say, someone asked me a question. I was doing an interview about a month ago, and someone asked me a question about, well, do you need to go to an MFA program, a Master of Fine Arts program, or do you need to go get a PhD in creative writing to be a writer? And I don't think that's true. I mean, certainly if you want to pursue that, that is certainly something you could do and something that you could accomplish. And that would be a great accomplishment if you can do that, but you don't necessarily need that. I would say my advice to aspiring writers would be to read a lot, read often, read everything you can get your hands on, and read outside of the genre that you love. So I love mystery and thriller stories. Those are my favorite, but I get so much enjoyment and inspiration as a writer from reading science fiction, and from reading nonfiction, and from reading romance, and from reading biography. I enjoy those genres, but I learn a lot. I tell people all the time, if you want to learn how to build a world or how to create setting, read a science fiction author. Read science fiction, because those writers have to create entire worlds, entire languages, entire norms for a society out of nothing. Think about J.R.R. Tolkien with the Lord of the Rings. Think about Terry Pratchett, who's another science fiction writer I love. Isaac Asimov, a lot of folks are familiar with him. Ray Bradbury. They created these worlds and these cultures just out of basically their own thinking. So that's just an example of how reading outside of your own genre can help. If you want to learn why people fall in and out of love with one another, or what it is that can lead to a crack or a fissure in a relationship, read a romance writer, read a romance novel, because they are so good at being able to kind of tease out those little fine moments and those fine elements that exist between relationships and why they work and why they don't work. So I would say read widely, read outside your genre, and get involved in a writing community or get involved in a writing group. West Virginia is very fortunate. Just about every section of the state has a writers group that meets periodically and meets regularly. And there's an organization called the West Virginia Writers Organization. I was fortunate enough to be a board member and past president of that organization. If you go to their website, wvwriters.org, they have a list of all the writing groups that meet throughout the state, when they meet, how often they meet, and who the contact person is. So if you live in the Eastern Panhandle, you live in Kanawha County, you live in Beckley, you live in Parkersburg, get involved in a writing community. Join one of those writing communities, and don't be afraid if you haven't had anything published. But get involved with that. Bring your work, share your work with that group, support others who are working on different projects, and that can help you stay motivated. That can help give you some ideas. But for me, writing groups always were good for me because it gave me a deadline. If my writing group, when I was in Huntington, we were called the Patchwork Writers. We met once a month. We met the second Monday of every month. And so I knew, okay, by the second Monday of every month, I've got to have something to share with this group. And so it kept me on a schedule, kept me on a deadline. And if you're one of those people that needs deadlines in order to kind of make progress, writing groups can give you that accountability that you're looking for. So that would be my two biggest pieces of advice: is read often, read outside your genre, read a lot, and get involved in a writing group or get involved in the writing community wherever it is that you live, either in West Virginia or anywhere, because that's going to help you grow and help nurture you as you continue to write.
Awesome. And I'd like to turn back to your writing for just a moment here. Do you have any upcoming works that you'd like to share with us?
Oh, sure. I just finished you mentioned Code for Murder a little while ago as one of my novels. I just finished the sequel to that book. It's called A Final Call. That book features a female homicide detective in Cleveland, Ohio named Stacy Tavitt. And a lot of my family at one time, and some still do, lived and worked in Cleveland, Ohio. So we went up there a lot to visit for holidays and family events and things like that. So I'm very familiar with Cleveland, Ohio. So that series, Code for Murder, and then a Final Call, follows Stacy Tavitt. So I just finished the last draft of that, and that's being looked at by my agent right now. So she's taking a look at it, and she'll give me some feedback in. And we're looking to have a publication date probably sometime later next year, maybe in the fall of 2021, closer to the holidays, maybe November, December timeframe, if all goes according to plan. And I'm working on some short stories. I'm working on another short story collection. So I've got 2 or 3 stories already finished, and I've got those sent out to some different literary journals that might be interested in publishing them. But I plan on doing another short story collection. So those are the 2 projects I've got sort of in the pipeline right now.
That's fantastic. And so where can we find more information about you and your books?
I'm on social media. I like social media. I know some authors don't, but I do, because it allows me to stay in contact with friends and family and readers and everything. And so I'm on Facebook. I have a personal page and an author page. If you just type in my name, it should come up. There's not too many Eliot Parkers that spell their name with 1 L and 1 T, so I'm pretty easy to find if you just search me on Facebook. I'm also on Twitter as well. My Twitter handle is E4419. You can find me there. I also have a website, elliottparker.com. There I've got information about all of my books, about Snapshots. I've got information about myself, my writing career, my teaching career, a place where you can contact me, a place where you can order my books if you're interested, or just leave me a comment or a question, or if you want to chat more about writing or anything else, you can reach me through my website as well. And in terms of where you can get my books, certainly if folks want to check them out at the Kanawha County Public Library, they are there. They're available online, certainly, and at any bookstore that you like to shop at, whether it be a Books A Million or a Barnes & Noble or a locally independent bookstore, which I hope folks will check out first, because those locally independent bookstores are big champions of writers and big champions of writers with connections to those communities. So if you can shop and get books at a locally independent bookstore, please do. But if you like to get them at Books A Million or somewhere else, you can get them there too.
Okay, great. And Eliot, would you care to share an excerpt from Reflections for us?
Absolutely. I will. I'll read just a portion of this, just so you can kind of get a flavor of this. This comes from Reflections. It's almost about a third of the way through the story, and this is where my narrator is walking through the cemetery, and he's getting ready to go to his dad's headstone, and he's sort of dreading that experience and not really looking forward to it very much. As I proceeded toward Dad's grave, the early morning humidity hung in the air like a thick wool blanket with its suffocating persistence, and it felt heavy in my lungs, forcing labored breathing. I looked around and observed other broken gravestones, some of them nearly 100 years old. That side of the cemetery was the oldest section, where many of the previous owners and caretakers of the cemetery of years past were buried. The graves were speckled with a granular substance, making them difficult to interpret or read. The cemetery ground buckled slightly under my feet. I smelled nothing other than the thick, still, calm air. My steps grew slower and smaller as I approached the grave. Finally, Dad's grave was visible. The flat pewter headstone at the base of his grave was decorated with ornate marble lettering, declaring this place to be his final resting place. The wispy grass under the headstone rose up in different directions. The nature and composition of the headstone gave the grave a regal appearance. Sometimes I felt guilty because Dad rested here alone. Mom was alone too, resting comfortably in that nursing home under the attention of strange men and women who made sure she was okay. Dad would not want to be separated from her, and yet here he was without her, surrounded by the graves of other family members, some he knew well, some he never knew. I dropped to my knees and my hands trembled. My stomach soured. Sometimes I needed medicine to calm my anxiety before coming to see him. Other times I relied on alcohol to take away the sadness and other feelings I had, but neither seemed to make the trips to the cemetery easier for me. Dad has been gone for 5 years, and I visit him at least once a month. I wonder if that is enough. How would Dad feel knowing I came to see him for just a little while, one day out of 30 or 31 days each month? Then I thought about how often I saw Dad growing up. Maybe my guilt was displaced. My dad was the only mortician in town, and he knew everyone. I could ask him anything about any family member in town, and he would tell me who their parents were, who they were married to, what they did as an occupation, and if their parents were still living. Our home was filled at Christmas time with succulent, mouth-watering cakes, pies, and candies from many of the widowed women in town or the surviving children or grandchildren of the parents Dad helped bury over the years. They gushed about him to Mom and me, and we could never go any place without him running into someone we knew, not that we went out as a family very often. Because of Dad's work, our house had a telephone in each room, including the bathroom. It would constantly ring, especially at night when a doctor, hospital, or family member placed a death call. Mom and I did a lot of activities together, just the two of us. Dad missed plenty of holiday dinners, Sunday church services, and many anniversaries and birthdays because he was busy comforting grieving families. Sometimes Mom and I would talk about Dad as if we were speaking about a mythical figure or someone from an urban legend. I never understood why Dad spent so much time away from Mom and me. He always said it mattered. When I needed Dad, he was at work. When Mom and I needed comfort, Dad was at work. When Mom had her stroke 7 years ago, Mom was home alone when it happened because Dad was at the funeral home comforting a sad mother who had just lost her son in a car accident. So I think I'll just stop right there just to give you a little flavor of the story. And so you can see as my narrator is coming to the gravestone, he's getting ready to come to that headstone and kind of spend some time there, all of these thoughts and memories keep coming back into his mind. And he's kind of sort of struggling to process and situate that with kind of the reality that he's facing of his dad being gone.
Thank you for sharing that, Elliot. Really appreciate that. Before we go, is there anything else you'd like to add that maybe we haven't covered in our conversation?
I don't think so, but I just want to thank you, Tara. I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks to the Kanawha County Public Library for hosting me and for doing this series. I know you've done several other authors as well, and so thank you for the opportunity and for the platform, and thanks so much for being big champions and supporters of our work. It's really appreciated.
You're very welcome, Elliot, and thank you so much for being with us today. It was great to see you, and thank everyone for attending. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. And again, Elliot can be found on various social media platforms. In the chat, I've added be found on Twitter at the handle E441, and also Parker.com, ELIOT, Parker.com. And again, thank you, Elliot, for being here. It was really good talking with you today.
Great talking with you, Tara. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Elliot.
Thank you all.